On April 26, 2011, a user posted a story on Nichan that garnered quite a bit of attention. Nichan users love a good mystery as much as the next person, and this particular story, a ghost story no less, gave enough information to allow users to go digging themselves and uncover whether the events were true or not. So, was it? Let's take a look. I'll include a link in the description to the full story, but to summarize, this particular Nichan user mentioned he was from H City in A Prefecture. A shocking crime took place there long ago, and another more recent crime prompted him to remember and share his story. According to the poster, the story itself was something he heard secondhand from a colleague, the person who actually experienced it. When the colleague was a teenager, a friend of his was renting an apartment. A woman had been killed in this apartment a few years earlier, but being a teenager, he didn't care. H City was apparently well known for its gangs of rough youths, and when the friends gathered at the apartment one night for a game of mahjong, the neighbour heard the noise and went over to complain. However, when the neighbour opened the door, they soon discovered why. Inside the apartment, they found a woman covered in blood dancing in the middle of the room, while the teenagers were screaming and jumped out the window. They hadn't been screaming because they were getting up to mischief. They were screaming because they'd seen a ghost. The event that prompted the user to share this story was another crime that took place in the same city. This crime saw an entire family killed before the murderer took his own life. As it turned out, that criminal was the same person who killed the woman in that apartment decades earlier. The story gave both the initials of where the poster lived, as well as certain dates and details of crimes that had taken place there. As you might expect, it didn't take Nichan users long to figure out what crimes this story was referencing. H City in A Prefecture turned out to be Hachinohe City in Aomori Prefecture. The story also mentioned being a port city, which Hachinohe is. The story also mentioned a woman, the blood-covered ghost, being murdered by an elementary school student. These types of crimes are obviously not very common, and with the city narrowed down, it wasn't too hard to find the crime in question. On December 21st, 1975, an 11-year-old boy was visiting his grandmother's house on the second floor of an apartment building with his younger sister. While there, he went downstairs to use the toilet and snuck into the apartment of a 29-year-old office worker. Despite coming from a well-off family, the boy intended to rob the woman, taking 50,000 yen he found inside the house. 2 years earlier, when he was only 9 years old, he had deliberately set numerous houses on fire, so he was known to already have a troubled background at the time. The woman returned to find the boy in her apartment. She screamed, "Thief!" and in response, the boy grabbed a knife from the kitchen and repeatedly stabbed her in the back. A neighbour saw the boy toss the knife and flee the apartment, and then found the woman on the floor covered in blood. She had been stabbed over 20 times. Police found the boy the next day when he returned because he was hungry. He was institutionalized, and for a while at least, that was that. After the woman's death, the apartment reportedly came to be known as a ghost spot around town. It didn't gain national fame, but locals claimed the ghost of that woman remained in her apartment and could be seen walking around, covered in blood. Over time, people mostly forgot about the incident, but on June 28, 2007, another incident was to occur that would bring the original crime back to the forefront of everyone's minds. In another apartment in Hachinohe City, a mother and her 3 sons were found dead. The husband hadn't shown up to work, so they called a relative to check and see if he was okay. It was then that the relative found his family. The husband was nowhere to be seen. Police eventually found him 40 kilometers away, sitting in his car on the side of the road. They began to question him when he suddenly reversed, put a knife to his own throat, and then drove right off a cliff in front of them. He was confirmed dead shortly thereafter. An autopsy confirmed that the family had died the night before. It turned out that after the husband had killed them, he then left the house and robbed a pachinko store before going on the run, eventually ending up where the police found him. Things got even stranger when it was revealed that he was the very same boy who had killed the woman in that apartment over 30 years prior. So, with all this under our belts, did that mean the story the Nichan user posted was true? It's not difficult to dig up details of a real crime and create a story based around it, after all. At the very least, the user was most likely a Hachinohe local. Despite the weirdness of both crimes, they never became massive nationwide news. They caused a massive stir in Aoyama Prefecture, but for the rest of the country, they barely registered as a blip. The story used actual facts from the 1975 crime and described Hachinohe in such a way that it could only really come from someone who lived there. Outsiders wouldn't know that this port city was full of delinquents and teen gangs in the 70s unless they, or someone else they knew, lived there at the time. The teens in the story were also mentioned as using thinner, which was apparently a very real problem in the area at the time. But again, not something you can just dig up on the internet. The apartment was also known as a ghost spot to locals, but it wasn't famous anywhere outside the city. Yet, oddly, this story was posted in 2011. The second crime involving the family, the one that supposedly reminded the user of the story, happened in 2007. This leaves a 4-year gap between hearing the crime and posting the story. Why did the user wait so long? It's here that things get even weirder. Users did a little more digging and discovered something interesting. The story about the blood-covered woman might not have been the original story. After all of that, it appeared to be a copy. An extremely similar story, not word for word, but definitely a play-by-play of the very same events, was posted to Nichan in 2007, only a month after the crime took place. It seemed to have been lost over the years and didn't garner quite as much attention the first time as this second story did. Yet, there it was. The same, more compact story, posted 4 years earlier and only a month after the real event took place. In the end, it seemed this story of the blood-covered woman dancing around an apartment was actually just a rip-off of another story that had been posted years earlier. Most of the events in the story were true, yes, and they likely could have only come from someone who lived in the area. But it most likely wasn't the user who posted in 2011. That, by all accounts, was just a slightly longer rewrite of the original. The original story was more vague in its details, however, never specifying a location. It gave the year, 1975, and mentioned a 5th grade boy stabbing a woman, but that was it. This second poster may have put 2 and 2 together and added further details to make their story seem more believable, or even might have been from the same area and thus felt an affinity for the story, further expanding on it to share with others. Whether this user was also from the same city, we may never know. So, what of the blood-covered woman and the teenagers in the apartment? The woman was a well-known legend around town at the time, but whether she actually existed or not probably depends on whether you even believe in ghosts or not. And the teenagers? Nearly 50 years later, there's no way to check. It's likely just a story someone created around a real crime and a real local legend that then made it big on Nichan decades later. It could be an embellished true story from someone's childhood, at least up until the ghostly part, but there's no way to confirm one way or the other. Either way, the twists and turns are more than enough to create a compelling real-life story, regardless of whether the ghost of a woman covered in blood danced around an apartment full of terrified teenagers. But what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you again next time.